All right, so now that you're done with actions and change, let's actually dive into instances and nodes. Now for this, we're not going to have a deep presentation because there's a massive amount of services, but just for a high level, we're going to look at inventory, config compliance, we're going to use Session Manager, which is a very handy tool, and we're going to look at many more capabilities offered within this suite of tools. Now you'll notice when we swap to the console here coming up, there's going to be a ton of services, and I'll touch on each of them at minimum at a high level, and we'll try and dive into as many as we can. So let's go ahead and wrap up this demo overview on exploring instances and nodes, and let's start getting our hands dirty and diving into the console. Okay, welcome back. Let's dive into instances and nodes. This section is going to be broken up into several clips because otherwise it would be a little lengthy and it'd be hard to follow after a certain time. So let's knock out a few of these capabilities in this first clip. The first one I want to talk about is compliance. Now, compliance allows us to scan our instances, which need to be managed instances, and we'll talk about those here coming up in this clip. But we can scan these for compliance and configuration and consistency. So it collects and aggregates data for us to view from our account and even other accounts and regions. So it allows for a central pane of glass and a central view into what's going on in our environments. The first thing we see at the top here is we have our compliance filtering. So what do we want to see? We can look at type, patch group, which we'll talk about here in a little while, or even the famous resource group. So you can see it pulls up our prod web resources resource group and that same instance. Now in the middle here, it gives us a summary of our compliance. So based on some config rules and some patch manager rules, and we'll look at state manager and patch manager here a little bit later on, it scans these instances to say, hey, are they compliant? Are they non-compliant? Are they critical, high, medium, low, etc.? So they have several categories that they can fall into. Now we have one instance and it's compliant, and you can see that here at the bottom. So if I click on this, it'll bring us to our Managed Instances tab. Now before we dive into this, let me go back, and if we select this instance here, you can see the ID of the compliance check, the compliance type, the severity, which is non-existent, and then some other details. And if I click on this, this is going to bring us to State Manager. Now don't worry about this yet, we'll talk about it here in the upcoming clips, but I wanted to show you how you can get there very quickly and what it relates to or what it's referring to when you see that ID. So let me close this out. I'll go back to my compliance screen. And when we click this instance, it brings us to our Managed Instance screen. So this is a good jump point into Managed Instances. Now, Managed Instances are machines configured for use with Systems Manager. So they have the SSM agent running on them, which is required, and they're connecting to SSM and reporting status. So this instance here, D6FD1, if I go to this instance, you'll see I have a role associated with it, EC2 SSM user. So this is very important. Your role has to have permissions, assuming you're using EC2, so that it can successfully be granted authorization to access Systems Manager. Now, I set this one up with way too many permissions, but this was easier just to show you. Do not set it up for Amazon SSM full access if you do not need to. Follow the principle of least privilege. So with that role assigned to this instance here, that's what's allowing us to essentially have an online status. It reports the different attributes of this instance, and it gives us shortcuts to the instance and config rules. Now, a neat feature here is we can actually auto-update that SSM agent on these instances if we wanted to. I won't do that here, but this is very handy. So now, if I go into here and I view our managed instance, you can see we get our descriptions. It gives some attributes that we configured. We'll skip inventory really quickly. You can see we can view our tags, the associations, which is what we just looked at when we checked out State Manager. And again, we'll talk about that coming up. There's patch, so what kind of patches and updates are installed and needed and which ones errored out. I haven't done any patching yet, so we don't see any. And then we have configuration compliance. So is it compliant or not, and when was the last check? Now let's jump back here to inventory. And this is going to jump to our next and last capability of this clip, the inventory capability. You'll see that we can collect inventory of our instances so we can see what's installed. And you'll see there are tons of capabilities and options that we can choose. We can see AWS components, and here's the SSM Agent. We can even view network interfaces all from this one dashboard. This is an awesome capability that Systems Manager provides for operational management. If this was a Windows instance, we could view the registry details for the registry on that instance. It's really sweet. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and go over here to inventory, and let's just talk about this really quickly. Now, when you get here, you'd have to set up your inventory. So let's just act like we're going to do that here. I would give it a name. We can specify our targets, so we can select all managed instances. You can specify a tag, or you can manually select them from a instance picker. Now I'll do all. We define a schedule, so how often do we collect data? And currently 30 minutes is the lowest you can go. So I'll leave that at 30. But if we wanted to, you can see we can specify several days, or if we wanted to, every so many hours. Now I'll do minutes, and then let's check out these parameters. So this is where, if we look back in managed instances here, and I go to inventory, this is where all of these are coming from. So in inventory, we would define what we want to collect. Now let's just assume I'm only working with Linux instances. So I'm going to get rid of all of these Windows specific components and parameters. So I'll leave the other stuff. You can see we can sync our inventory logs to an S3 bucket for compliance and auditing. So if I wanted to, I can enter a bucket name and prefix to store these execution logs. And then I would click Set Up Inventory. Now I've already done this, so I'm going to cancel out. I'll go back to inventory, and after your data is collected, this is what you would see, something similar to this. You can see we have our managed instances that show which ones have inventory enabled. It shows our components that we're collecting, the different applications, etc., etc. So it's showing us all of those different parameters that we specified. Now if I go to detailed view, this is where we can use a little bit more complex data analytic tools like Athena and Glue to perform data syncs on our instance types. Now let's just go ahead and go through this. I'm not going to create one, but we would give it a name. We would type the bucket that we want. We would do a prefix if we wanted to, specify which region that bucket's in, and then we can encrypt this as well. We would create it, and then we could have a resource data sync set up so we can view inventory data from multiple sources. Now, last thing before we wrap up is settings. Now, settings is where we can view our inventory associations. So the one we just created today is right here, and you can see the different description and attributes that go along with it. There's a description, there's resources, our parameters that we specified, targets, versions, and execution history. And you'll notice when we followed this ID, we ended up in State Manager. So I'm not going to cover any more of State Manager in this clip. Let's go ahead. This is a good breaking point. In the next clip, we'll pick up with hybrid activations.